March 15th, 1944, Baltimore, Maryland. The Riverside Community Nursery School occupied the second floor of a converted tobacco warehouse on Eastern Avenue, 3 blocks from the harbor where Liberty ships still slid down the ways every other week. The building retained the sweet, sour smell of aged tobacco leaf in its beams, despite 3 years of conversion, mixing now with the scents of children, tempera paint, graham crackers, the institutional soap used to scrub small hands before lunch. Constance Hartwell climbed the wooden stairs with a brown paper bag clutched in one hand. Her daughter Irene had gotten a nosebleed that morning while playing hopscotch in the yard, and she'd forgotten to pack spare handkerchiefs in the girls' school satchel. The hallway on the second floor was empty, children outside for their afternoon constitutional in the small fenced yard behind the building. Only one door showing a sliver of warm light and the murmur of voices. Constance approached the counselor's office where her 6-year-old daughter remained for an individual session, one of the twice-weekly meetings that had become routine since November. The door stood ajar about 4 inches, and the woman paused instinctively when she heard the voice of Mrs. Daphne Osgood. That voice, soft, measured, infinitely patient, had become familiar over these months, a reassuring presence in Irene's troubled young life. But something in its tone today made Constance stop, made her hand freeze on the doorknob before she could announce herself. "Irene, sweetheart, can you show me with your hands how big your bedroom is?" "About this big?" "And where's the window? On this wall or that wall?" The child's voice came earnest and trusting, eager to please the kind lady who had helped chase away the nightmares. Quote 1, quote 2, quote 3, quote 4, quote 5, quote 6, quote 7, quote 8, quote 9, quote 10, quote 11, quote 12, quote 13, quote 14, quote 15. Constance felt cold spread from somewhere deep in her chest, radiating outward through her ribs, down her spine like ice water in her veins. Her fingers tightened involuntarily on the brown paper bag, crinkling it. She knew she should push through that door immediately, stop this conversation, sweep her daughter up and demand to know what kind of therapeutic technique required interrogating a 6-year-old about house keys and jewelry boxes. But her body had turned to stone, her feet rooted to the warped floorboards. The counselor's voice continued, soft as velvet, enveloping, almost hypnotic in its gentle persistence. "And does your mother have any special routines? Does she go out in the evenings, or does she stay home with you?" "We stay home mostly. Sometimes Mrs. Kowalski from downstairs comes up and sits with me if Mama has to go to a war bond meeting or the ration board." "How often does that happen?" "Not very much. Maybe once a month. Mama doesn't like to leave me alone at night since Daddy died." Constance stepped back silently from the door, pressed her spine against the corridor wall. The paper bag slipped from her nerveless fingers, handkerchiefs scattering across the floorboards in small white squares like surrender flags. She didn't bend to retrieve them, just stood there, breathing shallowly, listening, as understanding crystallized into horror with the sharp clarity of breaking glass. This wasn't therapeutic conversation. This was interrogation. This was systematic, methodical, professional intelligence gathering about the apartment layout, their daily schedule, their valuables, their vulnerabilities. The counselor everyone adored, who'd helped Irene cope with night terrors after her father's death in Sicily last summer, who seemed the embodiment of kindness and maternal concern. This woman had just extracted from a 6-year-old child a detailed blueprint of their home and daily routine. For what conceivable therapeutic purpose? The answer arrived unbidden, monstrous and obvious, settling in Constance's mind with awful certainty. For no therapeutic purpose at all. For something else entirely. Constance steadied herself with an effort of will that made her hands shake, retrieved the handkerchiefs one by one from the floor, smoothed her plain navy dress, touched her hair to ensure the victory rolls were still in place, straightened her shoulders the way her mother had taught her. Spine straight, chin up, never let them see you falter. Waited a moment until her breathing returned to normal, then walked deliberately down the hall, her sensible work heels announcing her approach on the wooden floor with sharp, authoritative clicks, as though she'd just climbed the stairs and heard nothing unusual. She pushed open the office door with perhaps more force than necessary, entered with her practiced maternal smile firmly in place. Daphne Osgood turned smoothly from where she knelt beside Irene's small chair, her face arranging itself into an expression of warm welcome that would have seemed perfectly genuine if Constance hadn't just heard what preceded it. "Mrs. Hartwell, what a surprise! Irene and I were just finishing up our session." The counselor's voice held exactly the right note of pleased greeting mixed with mild professional surprise at the interruption. Irene hopped off her chair, ran to her mother with the unconscious grace of childhood. Constance embraced her daughter, held her close, breathed in the scent of her hair, Johnson's baby shampoo and the faint chalk dust from the classroom, and looked over the child's head at the counselor. Mrs. Osgood sat behind a scarred oak desk that had probably furnished some shipping company office before the war. Before her lay an open ledger with a marbled cover. In her hand, a fountain pen with a gold nib that caught the afternoon light. Ordinary scene, the picture of professional dedication. But now, Constance saw everything differently. Saw it with the sharp, suspicious clarity of someone who has just discovered a wolf in the henhouse. The ledger wasn't developmental notes tracking a child's emotional progress. It was inventory, a catalog, intelligence files, __quote _21 __. Constance said, forcing her voice to sound normal, forcing warmth into words that wanted to come out cold and accusatory. __quote _22 _. The counselor bent down gracefully, stroked the girl's hair with what appeared to be genuine affection. "Goodbye, dear heart. I'll see you Thursday afternoon. We'll work on those pictures you wanted to draw." Then she looked up at Constance, and for just a second, so brief it might have been imagined, something sharp and assessing flickered in her gaze, as though she'd sensed the shift in the mother's demeanor, registered the alarm barely concealed in Constance's eyes, calculated whether to be concerned. But her expression remained benign and open, professional warmth radiating from every feature. Constance heard herself say, Osgood said with that warm smile, "Trust." That word echoed through Constance's mind all the way home, ricocheting off the inside of her skull like a bullet in a closed room. She walked in silence through the March streets, gripping Irene's small hand tighter than usual, barely registering the sights around her. The row houses with their white marble stoops, the corner grocery with its ration posters in the window, the women in headscarves hurrying home with string bags of whatever they'd managed to buy. The girl chattered happily about something. The cartoons at the Saturday matinee, friends from school, a game they'd played. But her mother barely heard, offered only absent murmurs in response. At home, she settled Irene with her coloring books at the kitchen table, then sat by the window overlooking the street. Outside was an ordinary Baltimore March evening, slush from yesterday's snow melting in the gutters, row houses marching down the hill toward the harbor in their red brick monotony, sparse pedestrians hurrying home before the dim-out began. Everything normal, routine, safe. But for Constance, the world had shifted on its axis, tilted into something unfamiliar and threatening. She forced herself to replay the last 4 months in her mind, examining memories she'd taken at face value, looking for patterns she'd missed. The individual sessions had started in November, right after the Thanksgiving pageant where Irene had stood frozen on stage, unable to say her lines, tears streaming silently down her face. Daphne Osgood had called Constance aside afterward in the cloakroom, speaking quietly, sympathetically, one hand gentle on Constance's arm. __quote _29 __. Constance had been grateful, profoundly, overwhelmingly grateful. Irene had indeed changed after the telegram arrived in August. Quiet where she'd been boisterous, fearful where she'd been confident, crying at night from dreams she couldn't or wouldn't describe. Lieutenant Martin Hartwell had fallen during the Sicily campaign, one of thousands who never came home from that brutal summer's fighting. The telegram had been brief, the details sparse, the finality absolute. And Irene, who'd adored her father, who'd waited every day for his letters, who'd kept his photograph on her bedside table and kissed it goodnight. Irene had crumpled inward like a paper flower in flame. And the counselor had helped. Really helped. Over the weeks and months, the girl had grown calmer, started smiling again, playing with other children instead of sitting alone in corners. Started eating properly again, sleeping through most nights. The progress was undeniable, visible, a source of profound relief. Mrs. Osgood had seemed like a gift from Providence, an answer to desperate prayers. But at what cost? What had been extracted in exchange for that healing? Constance rose from the window, went to the secretary desk in the corner, Martin's desk, where he'd kept his papers, where his fountain pen still lay in the drawer though she couldn't bring herself to use it, and pulled out her address book. The small leather-bound book had been a wedding present from Martin's mother. Still had addresses of people who were dead now, addresses in cities she'd never visit. She flipped pages until she found what she needed. Wendell Thatcher, detective, Baltimore City Police. They'd met several times at neighborhood association meetings, those earnest gatherings where concerned citizens discussed victory gardens and scrap metal drives and how to spot saboteurs. He'd struck her as a serious man, competent, not given to dismissing concerns. She dialed the exchange with unsteady fingers, gave the operator the number, waited through a series of clicks and distant voices. Long rings. Then, Thatcher? Mr. Thatcher, this is Constance Hartwell. We've met at the Patterson Park neighborhood meetings. I remember, Mrs. Hartwell. Good evening. What's happened? I need to speak with you, in person. It concerns a series of burglaries in the neighborhood. I think I know who's behind them. Pause. She could almost hear him reassessing her, shifting mental gears from polite neighborly acknowledgement to professional attention. That's a serious statement, Mrs. Hartwell. I understand that. I wouldn't make it lightly. All right. Tomorrow, 2 o'clock. Police headquarters on East Fayette, 3rd floor, room 317. Ask for me at the desk. I'll be there, thank you. See you then. She replaced the receiver in its cradle with exaggerated care, as though the Bakelite might shatter. Her hands trembled. Maybe she was mistaken? Maybe paranoid? Maybe grief and stress and the constant low-grade anxiety of wartime had twisted her perceptions, made her see sinister purpose where there was only professional thoroughness. But the conversation she'd overheard wasn't imagination. Questions about the jewelry box, the valuables, the schedule, where the key was kept. Why would a counselor need that information for therapeutic purposes? What possible psychological benefit came from knowing where a house key hung, or what time a parent left for work? No therapeutic purpose, only practical. Learning when they could break into the apartment and what to take. Learning the layout, the routines, the vulnerabilities. Using a child as an unwitting intelligence source. Constance barely slept that night. Lay in the darkness of her bedroom, the room Irene had described so accurately to a stranger, staring at the ceiling, running through details, testing her theory for holes. Osgood had worked at the nursery school since fall 1941, nearly 3 years. And burglaries in the neighborhood had started around then, hadn't they? She tried to remember. The Kellerman family, robbed winter 1942. She remembered Mrs. Kellerman crying in the grocery store, saying they'd taken her mother's engagement ring. The Pascals, spring that year, April or May, they'd lost war bonds and cash. The Drummond family, summer 1943, wedding silver gone. The Vickers, fall, just before Thanksgiving. All of Mrs. Vickers' jewelry vanished while they were at church. All families from their nursery school. Constance knew those names, saw the mothers at holiday programs, in the cloakroom, at the corner store. All of them enrolled children at Riverside. And all of them, from the gossip she'd overheard, had been grateful for individual sessions with the wonderful Mrs. Osgood, who was so skilled with troubled children, who understood the particular stresses of wartime, who gave her time so generously. Coincidence? Constance didn't believe in coincidences, not anymore. not after what she'd heard. Osgood collected information through children, then passed it to someone, an accomplice, a partner in this grotesque enterprise. The burglar would know exactly when parents were gone, where valuables were kept, how to access apartments. Perfect scheme. Children were trusting, eager to please, told everything when asked by a kind adult. Parents were grateful to the counselor for her help, protective of those precious sessions, reluctant to intrude or question methods. Nobody suspected anything. And apartments got cleaned out one after another, efficiently, professionally, without leaving clues. Next morning, Constance brought Irene to the nursery school exactly as usual, maintaining the routine with grim determination. Daphne Osgood stood in the hallway chatting with the director, Mrs. Kimball, both women laughing about something. Saw Constance, waved with her familiar gentle smile, that warm maternal expression that had seemed so genuine until yesterday. Constance smiled back, nodded pleasantly, exchanged good mornings, played the role of unsuspecting mother with an actress's focus. Because Thatcher had said on the phone last night, his voice carefully neutral. ___39__. At 2 o'clock that afternoon, Constance sat in the detective's office on the 3rd floor of police headquarters, a cramped room smelling of cigarette smoke and old paper, filing cabinets lining the walls, a single window overlooking the street where afternoon traffic crawled past. Thatcher sat behind a desk piled with folders and reports, in his shirt sleeves, tie loosened, looking tired. He was perhaps 40, going gray at the temples, with the kind of face that inspired confidence, steady, observant, not quick to judge. He listened silently while she talked, took notes in a small notebook, asked clarifying questions in a neutral tone that gave away nothing of his thoughts. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair, studied the window for several long seconds. Finally, Thatcher considered, tapping his pencil against his notebook. He did remember several burglary cases in the Eastern District over the past years, professional lock jobs, precise knowledge of layouts, no clues left behind, no witnesses, no forced entry. Cases that closed unsolved because there was simply nothing to go on. If Hartwell's theory was correct, it meant criminals had operated for over 3 years, that a childcare worker was involved, that dozens of families might be at risk. But it also meant investigating a respectable professional on the word of one woman who'd overheard one conversation. Quote, 48. Quote, he said finally. Quote, 49. Quote, Constance listed them. Kellerman, Pascal, Drummond, Vickers, Ridgway, Ormsby. Thatcher wrote them down. Constance nodded, feeling something loosen slightly in her chest. He believed her. Or, at least, he was taking her seriously enough to investigate. That was something. The following days were an ordeal. She brought Irene to school, smiled at Osgood, even made small talk about the weather and the war news. Attended the Thursday session, sitting quietly in the corner while the counselor worked with Irene on drawings and puzzles. Osgood didn't object to her presence, incorporated it smoothly into the session, even made sympathetic remarks about how difficult it must be to let go after losing a husband. But those strange, probing questions didn't recur. The counselor asked about feelings, about dreams, about school friends. All appropriate, all therapeutic. Smart woman had sensed the change somehow and adjusted accordingly. Wendell Thatcher worked methodically. He pulled all burglary files from the Eastern District for the past 3 years, 17 cases in total. Created a chart. Date, address, family name, items stolen, method of entry. Then, he requested from Riverside Community Nursery School their enrollment records for the same period, claiming routine police record-keeping. Mrs. Kimball, the director, provided them without question. Helpful citizen cooperating with law enforcement. He started cross-referencing. The process took days, working late into evenings while his wife complained about cold dinners. But the pattern that emerged was too clear to dismiss. Of the 17 burglaries, 9 showed direct matches. Children from victim families had attended Riverside and had individual counseling sessions with Daphne Osgood. 9 out of 17. more than half. The 8 non-matches included 3 burglaries in different neighborhoods, 2 that appeared to be amateur work rather than professional jobs, and 3 that remained unexplained. But when Thatcher dug deeper into those 3 unexplained cases, he found something interesting. The Brennan family, their older son had attended Riverside until June 1942. Then they'd moved to a different neighborhood. The burglary occurred in September 1942, 3 months after they'd left. The Hoffman family, similar pattern. Daughter attended until March 1943. Family moved in May, burglarized in July. The Stein family. Son attended through fall 1941. Family moved to Philadelphia in January 1942, burglarized before they left in December 1941. Information collected by the counselor was being used even after children departed the school. The intelligence had a shelf life, remained valuable for months. Coincidence was eliminated. This was a system, an operation, a criminal enterprise running smoothly under the cover of childcare. Thatcher brought his analysis to his captain, Vernon Lattimore, a heavy-set man who'd worked his way up from beat cop and trusted evidence over intuition. Lattimore was skeptical initially, seemed far-fetched, almost paranoid, the kind of theory that could embarrass the department. But the statistics convinced him. 9 direct matches out of 17 cases, with the others explained by timing or location. Pattern too clear to ignore. "We need more than correlation," Lattimore said, jabbing a thick finger at the chart. "Need to catch them in the act or get confession. Can't arrest on statistics. Set up surveillance on this counselor. See who she meets, where she goes after work. If she's passing information to someone, we'll catch that contact." Surveillance began March 22, 1944. 2 detectives in rotation following Daphne Osgood from the nursery school to her boarding house on North Charles Street, a respectable establishment for single professional women. For the first week, nothing remarkable. Woman went to work, came home, occasionally visited a grocery or drugstore, attended a Wednesday evening lecture at the Enoch Pratt Library on child development. Lived alone in a single room, kept regular hours, paid her rent on time, exchanged pleasantries with her landlady. Model citizen, upstanding professional. Exactly what she appeared to be. Then, on March 29th, Wednesday evening, the pattern changed. Osgood left her boarding house at 7:30, walked 3 blocks east to a diner on Reed Street, a place called Murphy's, where merchant seamen and dock workers ate cheap meals. She entered, scanned the room, walked to a back booth, sat down across from a man who'd been waiting there. The detective on duty that night, Frank Salerno, a sharp-eyed Italian from Little Italy who could blend into any crowd, took a seat at the counter with a cup of coffee and a newspaper, watched in the mirror behind the counter. The man was approximately 35 years old, thin-build, wearing a dark suit that had seen better days, needed a haircut, nervous hands that drummed on the table. They talked for 20 minutes in low tones. No physical contact, no documents exchanged visibly, no money changing hands. But the conversation was intense, focused. The woman doing most of the talking, the man listening, nodding occasionally, once pulling out a small notebook to write something down. Then they parted. Osgood returned directly to her boarding house. The man walked to a parking lot 2 blocks away, got into a Dodge coupe that had rust on the fenders and a cracked windshield, drove toward the Harbor District. Salerno followed at a distance, careful not to spook him. The man drove to a warehouse district near Fells Point, the kind of area where longshoremen lived in rooming houses and bars stayed open all night. Parked on a street of shabby buildings, entered one of them through a side door. Salerno waited, copied down the address, the license plate number, a description of the man. Then drove back to headquarters to file his report. Next morning, Thatcher ran the license plate. Vehicle registered to Howard Lundy, age 35, address matching the rooming house Salerno had identified. Thatcher pulled Lundy's file. Not extensive, but suggestive. 1 prior arrest in 1938, possession of burglary tools, charges dropped for lack of evidence after the complainant declined to testify. Employment history spotty. Occasional locksmith work, odd jobs, nothing steady. No known family, lived alone, no visible means of support beyond those occasional jobs. Thatcher requested the full file from records. Interesting biography emerged. Howard Lundy had grown up in Philadelphia, son of a master locksmith who'd owned a shop on South Street. Learned the trade young, showed real aptitude for the mechanical side, could look at a lock and understand it, had what his father called quote, _57 ___, but also showed interest in the wrong applications of that skill. Caught twice as a juvenile trying to break into stores after hours, not to steal, but to prove he could open the locks. Sent to reform school at 16 after the second incident. Released at 18 in 1927, just in time for the Depression. Moved to Baltimore, worked briefly at a hardware shop. Then the Depression hit and jobs vanished. Drifted through the 1930s doing occasional locksmith work, living in rooming houses, getting by on the edge of things. Arrested in 1938 for possession of burglary tools after a beat cop found him with lockpicks and a flashlight in an alley behind a jewelry store at 2 in the morning. Lundy claimed he'd been hired to open the store for the owner who'd lost his keys, but couldn't produce the owner's name or any proof of employment. Charges dropped when the store owner, curiously, declined to press charges or testify. After that, Lundy disappeared from official records. No arrests, no tax returns, no employment records. Either he'd gone completely straight or completely underground. Thatcher presented this to Lattimore. Osgood meets with Lundy, known burglar with locksmith skills. She collects intelligence from children about their homes. He uses that intelligence to rob them. Perfect division of labor. She's the researcher, he's the executor. Lattimore nodded slowly. We need to catch him in the act. Can't arrest on suspicion and a meeting in a diner. Need evidence. Need him inside somebody's apartment with burglary tools. They discussed strategy. Wait for the next burglary? But when would it happen? Could be weeks. Could be months. Osgood seemed to work on some schedule they didn't understand, spacing out the thefts to avoid patterns, letting things cool down between jobs. And in the meantime, more families at risk, more children being used. Thatcher proposed an alternative. Create a target. Use a family from the nursery school. Have the mother feed false information through her child to Osgood. Plant a lure irresistible enough that Lundy would have to take the bait. Then, wait for him with a welcoming committee. Lattimore hesitated. Using civilians as bait was risky, potentially dangerous, violated departmental guidelines about putting citizens in harm's way. But Thatcher argued the civilians were already in harm's way. Every family with children at Riverside was a potential target, already at risk. At least this way they could control the situation, choose the ground, prepare for the burglar, protect the family involved. After considerable discussion and consultation with the department's legal advisor, Lattimore agreed reluctantly. But we need a volunteer. Can't order anyone to do this. Has to be someone who understands the risks and agrees willingly. Thatcher thought immediately of Constance Hartwell. She'd started this investigation, shown remarkable courage and intelligence in bringing her suspicions forward. And she had strong motivation, protecting her daughter and other children from continued exploitation. He called her that evening from his office, explained the plan carefully. She would resume individual sessions with Irene without her presence, allowing the counselor to work alone with the child again. Casually mentioned to her daughter some valuable item in the apartment, something attractive enough to tempt a burglar but not actually present, a lure. Osgood would extract this information through her usual methods, pass it to Lundy. Lundy would attempt the burglary, and police would be waiting inside the apartment. Constance listened silently on her end of the line. When he finished, she said quietly, "Quote 61. Quote 62. Long pause. Thatcher waited, didn't push. This had to be her choice. "What would I tell Irene?" Constance asked finally. "Tell her you inherited something valuable from a relative. Say, a silver tea service from your grandmother in Pennsylvania. Show her a box. Let her examine it. Make it real in her mind. She'll mention it naturally to the counselor during their next session. Children can't help talking about new, exciting things. And when Lundy breaks in and finds nothing? He won't get that far. We'll arrest him at the door. Another pause, then, all right, I'll do it. Not for me, for all the other families, for the children she's using. Constance agreed partly from civic duty, partly from anger. The anger had been building since that afternoon outside the counselor's office, cold and clarifying. This woman had violated something sacred, the trust between caretaker and child, the assumption that schools were safe, that professionals who worked with children were motivated by goodwill. Violated it for money, for stolen jewelry and war bonds and cash. Used children as tools, as unwitting intelligence agents against their own families. That violation demanded response, demanded justice. Next day, Saturday, April 1st, Constance went to a second-hand shop on Eastern Avenue, bought a wooden box about the size of a cigar box, plain pine with a brass clasp. Bought also some burgundy velvet fabric from the notion counter at Woolworth's. At home, she lined the box with the velvet, making it look like something that might house valuables. Then called Irene into the kitchen. "Sweetheart, look what came in the mail from Grandma Hartwell in Pennsylvania." She sent her silver tea service, the one she's been keeping safe all through the war. It's very valuable, been in the family for generations. We'll keep it up high where it'll be safe. Irene examined the box with wide, serious eyes, running her small fingers over the brass clasp, the smooth wood. "Can I see inside?" "It's packed very carefully in special paper. We won't unpack it until the war's over and we can use it properly. But isn't it beautiful?" "It's real pretty, Mama. Where will we keep it?" "On the shelf in my closet, way up top where nothing can happen to it." The child absorbed every detail with the absolute attention children bring to new things. Asked where Pennsylvania was, why Grandma sent it now, whether they could use it for a tea party someday. Constance answered patiently, building the fiction, making it real. Thursday morning, April 6th, Constance brought Irene to Riverside for her regular session with Mrs. Osgood. This time, deliberately, she didn't stay. Explained to the counselor that she had to run an errand, would be back in 40 minutes. Osgood smiled understandingly, assured her it was fine. They'd be just fine. Constance left her daughter there and walked 2 blocks to a pharmacy where Thatcher waited with the surveillance plan. She couldn't hear the session this time, but she could imagine it. The counselor's warm greeting, the careful establishment of rapport, then the subtle questions. "How are things at home, dear? Anything new or exciting happening?" And Irene, eager to share, bursting with the news. "Mama got Grandma's silver from Pennsylvania. It came in a beautiful box, real special. Mama says it's worth lots of money, so we keep it up high where I can't reach." The gentle probing would follow. "How lovely. Where does your mother keep it exactly?" "On the shelf in her closet, way up top." "Very wise to keep it safe. That sounds like quite a treasure." And the information would be logged in that marbled ledger, to be passed along at the next meeting in Murphy's Diner, to be converted into a target. That evening, Thatcher stationed 3 plainclothes officers inside Constance's apartment. One in the bedroom closet behind hanging dresses, one in the kitchen pantry, one in the bathroom. Constance and Irene stayed with Mrs. Kowalski 2 floors down, the neighbor who sometimes babysat. Constance sat in the woman's overheated parlor, drank the terrible chicory extended coffee that was all anyone could get anymore, tried to read a magazine, couldn't concentrate, kept glancing at the clock on the mantel. 9 o'clock. 10. 11. The officers waiting in darkness in her apartment, patient, professional. Nothing. Mrs. Kowalski talked steadily about her nephew in the Navy, about the ration situation, about the price of eggs. Constance made appropriate noises, barely heard the words. 11:30. Maybe it wouldn't happen tonight. Maybe Osgood needed time to pass the information. Maybe Lundy was cautious, waited days before acting. 11:45. In the apartment upstairs, the officer in the closet, Detective Frank Salerno, heard it first. Sound at the front door. Subtle scratching, clicking, metal on metal. Someone working the lock, and working it well. The door opens slowly, cautiously, letting in cold air and the smell of the street. Flashlight beams swept the front room, narrow and focused. Figure entered, closed the door behind him with care. Thin man in dark clothes, moving with practiced silence, confident in his skill. Headed straight for the bedroom like he knew exactly where to go. Salerno waited in the closet, breathing shallowly, hand on his service revolver. The burglar entered the bedroom, went directly to the closet, began reaching for the high shelf where the silver allegedly waited. And Salerno stepped out behind him, gun raised. "Police! Hands up, don't move!" Howard Lundy froze absolutely still for perhaps 2 seconds, calculating odds, calculating possibilities. Saw the gun, saw a second officer appearing in the bedroom doorway, saw a third coming down the hall. Saw no escape route. Slowly raised his hands, fingers spread wide. All right. Don't shoot." They arrested him on the spot, cuffed him, searched him. Found lockpicks in his jacket pocket, flashlight, a cloth bag for carrying goods, a small folding knife. Nothing else. No weapon. Professional burglar, not a violent criminal. Thatcher arrived 15 minutes later, interviewed Lundy in the apartment before taking him downtown. Lundy said nothing at first, asked for a lawyer. But when they searched his rooming house, with a warrant obtained by a night judge, they found a collection of stolen property that couldn't be explained. Jewelry in a shoebox under his bed, war bonds in denominations matching those reported stolen from the Drummond family, ration books with other people's names, even a silver picture frame reported missing from the Pascal burglary 2 years earlier. At headquarters, Lundy held out for 6 hours of interrogation, insisting he knew nothing, had found the items, couldn't remember where. But the evidence was overwhelming and his story impossible. Finally, at 6 in the morning, he broke. Asked for coffee, asked for cigarettes, asked what kind of deal he could get. Thatcher said. Lundy considered, weighing loyalty against prison time. Prison won, Lundy thought. Thatcher had him sign a confession, type it up proper, every detail. Then, at 9 in the morning on April 7th, he and 2 uniformed officers went to Riverside Community Nursery School. Daphne Osgood was in her office, preparing materials for the day's sessions. Looked up when the officers entered, and for just a moment her composure slipped. Fear flickered across her face, quickly suppressed. But she knew why they were there. "Mrs. Daphne Osgood?" Thatcher said formally. "Yes? You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit burglary, receiving stolen property, and contributing to the delinquency of minors. You have the right to remain silent." Parents arriving that morning saw the beloved counselor being escorted out in handcuffs, saw police searching her office, saw the director, Mrs. Kimball, crying in the hallway. Shock rippled through the neighborhood like a seismic wave. The woman who'd helped so many children, who seemed so kind and dedicated and professional, arrested for running a burglary ring. The trial began in June at the Baltimore Circuit Court. Prosecution presented overwhelming evidence. Lundy's detailed confession, the correlation between nursery school enrollment and burglary victims, testimony from Constance Hartwell about the overheard conversation, statements from other mothers who remembered similar probing questions during their children's sessions, the stolen property found in Lundy's possession matching reported thefts. Defense tried multiple strategies. Argued Lundy was lying to reduce his own sentence, that the correlation was mere coincidence in a neighborhood where most families used the same school, that Hartwell had misinterpreted an innocent therapeutic conversation, that professional child psychologists often ask detailed questions about home environment as part of standard assessment. Brought in an expert witness, another psychologist, who testified that questions about family routine and household layout were common in trauma therapy. But the prosecution countered effectively, brought in parents from 9 burglarized families, all of whom testified their children had individual sessions with Osgood in the months before their homes were robbed, showed the statistical impossibility of that being coincidence. Most damagingly, presented Osgood's own ledger seized from her office, where entries about individual children included notes like __quote _98 _ and _quote _99 _ and quote 100 _. Information that had no therapeutic value but perfect criminal application. Osgood herself took the stand, composed and articulate, testified that the notes were shorthand for family dynamics, that understanding a child's physical environment was essential to trauma work, that she'd never met Howard Lundy, that the meeting in the diner must have been mistaken identity. But her testimony crumbled under cross-examination. The prosecutor introduced bank records showing deposits to her account that corresponded with burglary dates, showed photographs of her entering and leaving Murphy's diner on dates matching Lundy's calendar, confronted her with the specificity of her ledger notes, asking what therapeutic purpose was served by recording that a family kept their house key __quote _101 __. She had no good answers. The mask of professional competence slipped, revealing calculation underneath. During the trial, fascinating details emerged about Osgood's methodology. She didn't just ask direct questions. That would raise suspicion. Instead, she used genuine play therapy techniques, had children draw detailed pictures of their homes, room by room, built models with blocks showing furniture placement, played elaborate house games with dolls where children acted out daily routines. Through these activities, she extracted layouts, schedules, valuables, completely natural in a therapeutic context. Any parent observing would see a counselor helping a child process trauma through creative expression. Only she was mining the results for criminal intelligence. Her credentials were real, which made the betrayal worse. Daphne Osgood had a degree in child psychology from a teacher's college in Pennsylvania, had worked at 2 previous schools in Philadelphia with good references. She knew her field thoroughly. The children she counseled genuinely improved under her care. Fewer nightmares, better social integration, reduced anxiety. She was skilled at her profession. She just used that skill to gain trust, access, information for a secondary purpose. The prosecution emphasized this in closing arguments. This wasn't a con artist pretending to be a counselor to get access to homes. This was a real counselor who added burglary intelligence to her professional duties. That makes her more dangerous, not less. Because who would suspect someone so qualified, so effective, so trusted? The defendant used her genuine skills to exploit the most vulnerable, traumatized children who needed help, trusting parents who sought assistance. She healed with one hand while robbing with the other. That calculated duplicity deserves no mercy. The jury deliberated 3 hours, returned with guilty verdicts on all counts. Judge Cranston, a stern man who'd served in the First War, sentenced Osgood to 10 to 20 years at the Maryland Correctional Institution for Women in Jessup. Howard Lundy received 15 to 30 at the Maryland Penitentiary. Aftermath rippled through Baltimore for months. Other families came forward, recognizing they'd been victims but had never connected their burglaries to the nursery school. Final count reached 13 burglaries definitively linked to the Osgood-Lundy operation, with 3 more probable but unproven. Estimated total loss, over $15,000 in 1944 values, equivalent to several years' salary for a shipyard worker like Constance. Riverside Community Nursery School underwent complete review by the Baltimore Department of Education. Director Mrs. Kimball resigned, accepting responsibility for inadequate oversight, though she'd had no knowledge of the crimes. New protocols established. All counseling sessions must be documented in detail. Parents must give written consent for any individual work with children. Sessions must be conducted in rooms with observation windows or with parents present on request. Other childcare facilities in Baltimore adopted similar measures preemptively. The case attracted attention far beyond Baltimore. Newspapers in Philadelphia, Washington, New York ran front-page stories. Trusted counselor turned burglar became a cautionary tale, reprinted in psychology journals and law enforcement bulletins. Child welfare organizations issued guidelines about professional boundaries, appropriate questioning, safeguards against exploitation of vulnerable children. Criminologists studying the case later noted that Osgood represented a particular type of criminal, the professional parasite. Someone who uses legitimate professional access for illegitimate gain, not instead of doing the professional work, but alongside it, parasitically extracting additional value from the trust relationship. The pattern appeared in other fields. Accountants embezzling from clients while maintaining accurate books. Lawyers stealing from estate funds while providing competent representation. Doctors selling patient information while delivering quality care. The professional work creates trust and access. The criminal activity exploits both. What makes these cases difficult to detect is that the professional genuinely performs their role competently. No complaints, no signs of incompetence, no financial irregularities in the professional sphere. The crime occurs in a separate domain, using access granted by the profession. Osgood helped children therapeutically. That was real. Parents saw measurable improvement and became more trusting, more willing to allow private sessions, less likely to question methods. Perfect cover. And because she possessed genuine professional skills, she could navigate therapeutic conversations naturally, making information extraction seem organic rather than scripted. Years later, a researcher at Johns Hopkins wrote a paper on the case titled "The Paradox of Professional Crime: When Competence Enables Corruption." The thesis: genuine professional competence, rather than being protective against criminality, can actually enable it by creating deeper trust and better access. The mediocre counselor who asked intrusive questions would raise immediate suspicion. The skilled one could weave those same questions into apparently therapeutic activities and extract far more information without triggering alarms. The only defense against such criminals? Vigilance and pattern analysis, which is exactly what Constance Hartwell and Wendell Thatcher provided. Constance noticed the wrong questions, trusted her instinct despite self-doubt. Thatcher connected isolated burglaries to a common thread through systematic analysis. Together, they exposed a system that might have continued for years, perhaps decades. The case taught Baltimore, and by extension other cities, lessons about trust and verification. Trust remains necessary. Society can't function without trusting teachers, doctors, counselors, clergy. But blind trust creates vulnerability. Critical thinking, attention to detail, willingness to ask uncomfortable questions, these aren't distrust, they're maturity. Constance demonstrated that mature approach throughout. She didn't rush to public accusation based on suspicion. She verified her theory through proper channels, reporting to police, providing evidence, cooperating with investigation. She maintained normal behavior to avoid alerting the suspect. She even volunteered for the dangerous role of bait, knowing it served the greater good. She acted reasonably, systematically, responsibly, and thereby saved many families from robbery and protected children from further exploitation. This exemplifies civic vigilance in its best sense. Not paranoid suspicion of everyone, not destructive accusation without evidence, but attentive concern for community safety and willingness to act upon discovering genuine threat. The balance between trust and verification, between cooperation and caution. Daphne Osgood served 14 years at the Maryland facility, model prisoner, participated in educational programs, showed no disciplinary problems. Released in 1958 at age 53, hair gone gray, health decline from institutional life. Upon release, she moved to Ohio, worked as a file clerk in a library, lived in a boarding house, never sought employment involving children again. Died in 1967 of heart failure, unmarried, largely forgotten except as a footnote in criminal justice textbooks. Howard Lundy remained imprisoned until 1959, served hard time, aged poorly. Released at 50, health ruined by years of institutional food and cigarettes, found work as a night watchman at a warehouse. Died 2 years later of cirrhosis. No family at the funeral. Neither Osgood nor Lundy ever expressed genuine remorse during incarceration. Both maintained versions of justification, Osgood insisting she'd helped children despite what happened, Lundy arguing he'd only taken from people who wouldn't miss it. The rationalizations of criminals who refuse to acknowledge their victims' humanity. Constance Hartwell continued working at the shipyard until victory in Europe, then transitioned to civilian employment at Stewart's department store in the ladies' coat department. Raised Irene alone through the difficult post-war years, saw her graduate from high school, watched her marry a returning veteran, held grandchildren. Never remarried herself, Martin had been her one love, and his loss left a space nothing could fill. But she also never forgot that March afternoon in 1944, standing in the hallway outside the counselor's office, hearing questions that shouldn't have been asked, feeling the cold realization of betrayal settling into her bones. Never forgot that she'd acted on that realization despite doubt, despite fear of being wrong, despite the easier path of dismissal and denial. She'd trusted her judgment, contacted authorities, seen it through. In 1959, when Detective Wendell Thatcher retired after 30 years of service, he gave a speech at his retirement dinner that mentioned the Osgood case. Sometimes, he said, the biggest breaks come from ordinary citizens paying attention. Mrs. Constance Hartwell saved this city more grief than she'll ever know, just by listening and having the courage to report what troubled her. That's the best kind of police work, the kind civilians do without knowing they're doing it. Constance attended that dinner, one of the few civilians invited, heard those words, felt vindicated. She'd done the right thing, the hard thing. And it had mattered. The war ended. The men who came home changed. Baltimore rebuilt, grew, prospered through the 50s and 60s. Riverside Community Nursery School continued under new management, new protocols, new awareness. But the memory of Daphne Osgood's betrayal lingered in that neighborhood, passed from one generation of parents to another as cautionary tale. Watch what your children tell strangers. Notice what questions they're asked. Understand the difference between appropriate professional inquiry and intrusive probing. Trust, but verify. Protect those who cannot protect themselves. Because that's what Constance Hartwell did one March day in 1944, when she stood in a hallway and refused to ignore what she'd heard. And in doing so, she taught everyone who learned her story that vigilance is never paranoia when children's safety is at stake. That intuition deserves investigation, that ordinary people can stop extraordinary crimes. Baltimore, 1944. A nursery school, a counselor, trusting children. Simple scheme, terrible betrayal. A story that could have continued for years, except for one mother's attention and courage. One chance moment that saved families and protected innocence. In the decades since, the Osgood case has been studied in criminal justice courses, analyzed in psychology seminars, referenced in training manuals for social workers and law enforcement. It represents a peculiar intersection of professional competence and moral bankruptcy, a cautionary tale about how trust can be weaponized by those who understand its mechanisms. The psychological profile that emerged from court testimony revealed a woman of above-average intelligence, genuine empathy for children's emotional needs, and complete moral detachment regarding consequences. She could comfort a crying child with authentic warmth while simultaneously cataloging the family's vulnerabilities for exploitation. The compartmentalization was complete, almost clinical. The defense psychiatrist argued diminished capacity. The prosecution's psychiatrist countered that her elaborate precautions to avoid detection demonstrated clear understanding her actions were wrong. The jury sided with the prosecution. The lasting impact on Baltimore's childcare community was profound. The new protocols, documented sessions, parental oversight, clear boundaries became standard practice nationally. The case accelerated a broader movement toward transparency and accountability in child welfare services. Irene Hartwell grew up knowing her story had helped catch criminals. Her mother told her the truth when she was 12. Irene's reaction was complex. Pride mixed with anger at being used, lingering distrust of authority figures. She spent years in therapy working through the betrayal. Eventually became a social worker herself, specializing in child welfare, driven partly by desire to ensure other children were better protected than she'd been. In a 1975 interview with a Baltimore Sun reporter, Irene reflected, quote, 107 __. That wisdom captures the case's enduring lesson. The cost of false alarm is trivial compared to the cost of missed detection. Continued exploitation, multiple victims, prolonged harm. Wendell Thatcher's career flourished after the case. He became captain, eventually deputy commissioner, retired with honors in 1959. But he always said the Osgood case was his most important work because it proved ordinary citizens and police, working together, could solve seemingly unsolvable crimes. In his retirement speech, Thatcher said, quote, 108 __. The physical remnants of the case are scattered now. The courthouse where the trial occurred was demolished in 1968 to make way for a parking garage. Riverside Community Nursery School closed in 1962 when the building was sold for commercial development. The rooming houses where Lundy and Osgood lived have been converted to apartments. Murphy's Diner where they met is now a tax preparation office. The police headquarters on East Fayette became a museum, but the case itself remains, preserved in court records, newspaper archives, academic papers, police training materials. Remains as warning and example both. Warning about trust without verification. Example of vigilance properly applied. A story of ordinary evil and ordinary heroism, playing out in a Baltimore neighborhood during wartime, resolved by one mother's attention and courage. That's what makes it endure. Not exceptional circumstances or exotic criminality, but mundane settings and common vulnerabilities, and the reminder that protection depends on people paying attention. People willing to notice what's wrong, report what troubles them, act on instinct despite uncertainty. The physical remnants of the case are scattered now. The courthouse where the trial occurred was demolished in 1968 to make way for urban renewal. Riverside Community Nursery School closed in 1962 when the building was sold for commercial development. The rooming houses where Lundy and Osgood lived have been converted to modern apartments. Murphy's Diner, where they met their secret meetings, is now a tax preparation office. The police headquarters on East Fayette became part of a historical museum complex. But the case itself remains, preserved in court records, newspaper archives, academic papers, police training materials. Remains as warning and example both. Warning about trust without verification. Example of vigilance properly applied. A story of ordinary evil and ordinary heroism playing out during wartime, resolved by one mother's courage. Constance Hartwell died in 1982 at age 74. At her funeral, Detective Thatcher spoke briefly about March 1944, when a young widow came to his office with a theory. Quote, 109, quote, he said. Quote, 110, quote. The neighborhood remembered. That generation passed the story to children and grandchildren, not as myth but as fact, as reason to stay vigilant. Because threats to children don't always come from strangers, from obvious predators in dark places. Sometimes they come from professionals with credentials and kind smiles, from institutions that seem safe because they're supposed to be safe. Defending against them requires not paranoia but attention, not suspicion of everyone, but willingness to notice when something's genuinely off. That's what Constance Hartwell did. Noticed, trusted her notice, acted on instinct despite uncertainty. And that action, born of maternal instinct and civic duty, stopped a criminal enterprise and protected the vulnerable. That's the story. That's the lesson. That's the legacy that endures beyond the crime itself.